Good morning. In this week's parasha of Vayechi, we read about the last years of Yaakov's life, in fact, even the last days of his life. The Torah tells us, Vayechi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim shvayis shana. Yaakov lived in the land of Egypt for 17 years. V'yimei Yaakov shnei chayav sheva shanim v'arbim u'mat shana. And Yaakov lived for 7 years, 140 years. So the question I want to explore is, what does it mean that he lived these 17 years in the land of Egypt? We already know from last week's parasha that he moved down to Egypt. We already know from the calculation done then when he tells Pharaoh he was 130, and the Torah tells us here he was 147. How many years have elapsed? So what is the Torah trying to communicate to us by telling us about his 17 years of his life in Egypt? So the Or HaChaim says something very interesting, that he says, for the truth is, for most of Yaakov's life, he lived a very, very difficult life. He achieved a great deal. He was a holy person. The struggles were holy struggles, but it was a life of difficulty. It was a life in many ways of pain. And he says, but these last 17 years of his life were what he calls chayei shalva, a life of serenity, a life of goodness, a life of satisfaction, a full life in every sense of the word. And therefore he says, Vayechi Yaakov, do you want to know where Yaakov really lived? Be'eretz Mitzrayim. That where he experienced the full life in the land of Egypt for those 17 years. The Meshech Chochmah says a different explanation. He says that you have some people who live for themselves. The goodness of their life, the accomplishments of their life are felt within their own selves. And he says that's good. That's not a bad thing. That's just some people are. Some people, their mission is to grow spiritually, to elevate their souls, to achieve something great within themselves. That's the case with many people. Some people, he says, however, their goodness and their bracha is found not only within themselves, but within their families. And some within their communities, and some within their cities. Yaakov, he says, the goodness of his life was found throughout the entire land of Egypt. In fact, he says, we know famously that the interpretation of Pharaoh's dream with the 7 fat cows and the 7 thin cows was that the land of Egypt would experience 7 years of prosperity and 7 years of famine. Well, our sages tell us they actually experienced only 2 years of famine. Because when Yaakov comes down to Egypt after 2 years and blesses Pharaoh, the power of Yaakov's blessing and the power of Yaakov's righteousness was such that the famine was abated. That people lived in peace and goodness for many years afterwards. However, the Sephorno says, after Yaakov's death, the famine returned. Clearly, the famine didn't just end because that was the time. Clearly, it was delayed in the merit of Yaakov and in the blessing of Yaakov. And so he says that's what's happening here as well, is that you have, and that's why, just by the way, the Sephorno says, Meshech Chochmah quotes the Sephorno, that when the brothers come to Yosef with their problems and uncertainties, Yosef says to them, don't worry, I will take care of you, ve'achalkel, I will provide for you, I will provide for your children. So clearly there was a concern that there would be no food, and Yosef was assuring of that, so that was Yaakov's influence and blessing. And so we have these two different explanations. The first one is, the life of Yaakov was in the land of Egypt. He survived and accomplished and achieved and struggled for many, many years before that. But he truly lived experiencing the goodness and sweetness of life for those 17 years in the land of Egypt. The other explanation of the Meshech Chochmah is that when he lived in Egypt, it wasn't just for himself. It wasn't just a life in which he accomplished, but it was a life in which he blessed all the residents of Egypt. And in fact, this is not the first time we see this sphere of influence of Yaakov. In Parashat Vayechi, Yaakov mi Beersheba. Yaakov left Beersheba and went to Haran. Why is it telling us he left? So Rashi tells us over there, because when Yaakov left Beersheba was a different city. He brought a beauty and a sparkle and a shine and a light to the city of Beersheba that departed where he went. So those are the two ideas over here. The Or HaChaim also has another very interesting idea. He says the years of his life were 7 and 40 and 100. Now usually when we're counting somebody's life, we count from the bigger number down, 147. Here we're counting 7, 40, 100. So he says because he had 47 really good years. 17 years at the end were beyond compare, but 47 good years. What were those? 6 years of his life, the first 6 years of his life when he was a child. It's wonderful. Everyone likes being a little kid. Sometimes frustrating at the time, but in retrospect it was good years. Right after that, he says trouble started with Esav. Esav gave him endless trouble. Then he is in Lavan's house and Lavan gives him trouble. But he says for 13 years, he got to spend time with Rachel. And for those 13 years that he was married to Rachel, that was wonderful. So those also count. Then he says he had 11 years in addition to that with Yosef until Yosef was 17 years old. So that's now 30 years. And then he says the final 17 years of his life were such wonderful years. But the rest of his life was characterized by terrible difficulties. But the years of his life were really 17 years. The years of his life had the influence on the whole of Egypt. 47 good years, 100 years of struggle and hardship, but 100 years in which he accomplished so much, became the father of the entire Jewish people. Shabbat Shalom.